Welcome back. We are heading on to the market discussion segment. Of course, these days, talking about businesses, we can't disregard the situation in the country, politically, and of course, among the citizens as well. So that actually affects businesses in a major way. Now, of course, the impact of the Easter Sunday attack on the specific sectors has been discussed a lot. Today we are actually going to be focusing on the impact on the tourism sector. And to do this, we brought on a very familiar face to business today, Mr. Travis Gomes. He is actually the product head at Frontier Research, and he is here with us. Welcome to the show. Great to have you again. Travis, first off, I mean, talking about, before we head on to the tourism sector, the market itself, the stock market, how's the activity level been?
Yeah, so as you would expect in a situation like this, the activity is quite dull because, as you know, it's very much dependent on the sentiment. And right now what we've been seeing is there's a lot of foreign outflows that also been happening from both the government bond market as well as the stock market. And also, I mean, it's a lot to do with what people are expecting in the future, because currently a lot of the companies are releasing their quarterly results for the March quarter. So going into the next few quarters, I think the worry is that, because of this, basically a lot of the businesses across the different segments would be impacted.
Now, you talked about the foreign outflow. For a while, because of the situation in the country, there were a lot of joint ventures being pursued. And of course, there's a trade war happening in the world. And a lot of people are rushing to find, hey, this might be a safe bet. So what does that mean for Sri Lanka?
So in the immediate aftermath, what you expect is that those sort of things would be put on hold, or people would be reassessing some of those. But I mean, the more longer term projects. So I think a lot of them, whether they go ahead or not, very much depends on the response by the government and the authorities to sort of bring the situation back to normal. So the more, if the government and the relevant authorities are able to convey that signal to the foreign parties that Sri Lanka is now safe for business, we should expect to see a turnaround. But I mean, the immediate reaction, as you would expect, would be people would be a bit cautious.
Now, the unfortunate scenario is there have been attacks around the world of this sort. Most recently, we saw in New Zealand there was a Christchurch shooting that got a lot of publicity, but there have been a lot of small attacks around the world. What are some similarities between those attacks and the Sri Lankan attack, and what can we learn from them to actually adjust in a way that will gain the investor confidence and actually get Sri Lanka to the level it was at?
Yeah, so as you would expect, both the tourist arrivals and the earnings would be negatively impacted, but the extent to which it's impacted depends on a number of factors. And based on some of the preliminary research that we have done, as well as some of the global research, what they've found is that basically there are two main factors. One is the nature of, the reason for the disruption. Is it because of terrorism? Is it a natural disaster? Is it a political crisis? So when it comes to, if you look at the sort of situation that we faced, if it's perceived that it's like a domestic related issue, as was the case in Kenya in 2013, there was one attack which is on like a shopping mall, which was more for targeting tourists. So because of that, there was an impact. Whereas in that same year, there was another attack in a university, which didn't really have an impact because it was seen more as like a impact on the domestic market. So in Sri Lanka's case, looking at the Easter Sunday attacks, there was that element of that, because that places of worship were targeted, and it was mostly locals that were affected. But at the same time, there was also a terrorism aspect to it, because in terms of seeing who the perpetrators were, as well as given that hotels were targeted and foreigners were affected due to that.
I mean, a lot of our news articles and the news agencies carried this as the main article for a long period of time, and there were a lot of high-profile victims involved.
Yes, so overall, you can kind of classify this that it's very much a terrorism-related impact. So a good case study for that is looking at what happened to Bali. So in 2002 and in 2005, they faced these terrorism-related attacks where a number of tourists were killed. And looking overall at tourism-related disruptions, what they see is that it takes about a year for tourist arrivals to bounce back to the level that they were before.
Barring any other unfortunate instances, I guess.
So one is that, so one is the nature of the attacks, the other is the sort of what will be the response in the immediate aftermath. So in the case of Bali, what the authorities did was that, there was a very strong, both from the international community as well as the local community, there was a strong statement was put out to try to identify what was the reason, and there was tangible steps that were taken to sort of ensure the security, which was coupled with a very strong marketing effort that was put in for that. So, that's what we sort of have to wait and see in terms of what is the response of the authorities to try to make sure that this situation doesn't get prolonged.
I guess nothing but time will reassure people.
Yes.
But the year, how does that come into play? The year of saying, all right, now we'll bounce back. Now people might be confident enough to come in. Is that directly related to the news cycle, or is it just a confidence thing?
It's very much to do with the confidence thing, and so it's very much to see in terms of whether the sentiment improves or not. Because the danger we sort of face right now is that, even though this incident happened more than 2 weeks ago, still the situation seems to be not very settled as it is, and there's a sentiment, even with the events surrounding the event also, that the government may have mismanaged the situation, or that right now the government may be they're having difficulty with bringing the situation back to normal. So the danger with something like that is that if it starts being perceived as it's like a general political crisis, or that the disruption is very much political related, so that tends to be much more significant. A case study for that is what happened in Egypt. So in Egypt in 2011 you had the Arab Spring, and where a lot of the countries in that region were also affected, but subsequent to that they had like a military coup, and then there was also terrorism related issues with ISIS, where some of the tourists there were affected. So their tourist sector has been in a slump more or less for a prolonged period. So even looking at the latest
data,
the
pyramids and all.
Even with all that attraction, because if you take the most recent data, the tourist arrivals are less compared to what it was in 2010. It's less by 6 million tourists. So that's the sort of danger that we sort of want to avoid if that sentiment does not change.
Now, Travis, before this situation happened, a lot of people were leaving their so-called industries and heading into the tourism sector because there was so much money to be earned. There was a lot of middle businesses and small businesses that got started and were by day to day. Now, what happens to these guys in that period of 1 year?
Yeah, so right now, some of the immediate response has been from the government also is to give some of the concessions to the hotel operators. So I think some of the recent policies they introduced was they announced that they will defer some of the tax on the tourist authorities. Then they're encouraging the banks to give a moratorium on the interest rates that they have to pay. But a lot of them has been targeted at the formal sector, at the hotel operators, which is reasonable given that they are the ones who are directly sort of impacted.
Hotels are impacted, but there were a lot of people who started like small businesses around those.
Yes, exactly. So
like
I think so. The danger in this situation is, so the importance is not to ignore them, because a lot of the growth that we've been seeing in the post-war period has very much been driven by the supplementary tourist establishments and this whole ecosystem that has been created around the tourism, which is, when it comes to whether it's like tour guides or whether it's whether people providing transportation.
There's aviation, there's camping and all those.
Yeah, so there's like a whole industry that has formed around it, which is more or less organically it has come about. And if you look at the parts of the country where those kind of activities have taken off, are the areas which have seen the fastest like economic growth as well. So it's important in this context not to ignore them, because a lot of the growth that has come in is very much because of the supplementary and the informal sector.
Now, considering the small businesses and medium businesses, yes, a lot of people will be affected, but when it comes to the big hotels, the 5 stars and the multi-room, multi-star hotels, they employ a lot of people, and they are they own a very completely different industry. How will they sustain themselves without the tourist income, because the taxes alone will not cut it for them?
Yeah, so when it comes to the city hotels, I mean, even prior to this, there had been, if you look at the performance of a lot of these hotel operators, they weren't doing so great. Okay. So one is very much, I think, is that they have been, the formal hotels sector has been a bit slow to sort of adapt to the changing sort of circumstances in tourism. Because what we've been seeing is that there's been this shift away from sort of like the traditional tourist markets, where traditionally it was mainly tourists from Western Europe that was coming to Sri Lanka, and very much their sort of interest was, what the hotel operators usually call that, the sun, sand and sea, sort of, that was their sort of attraction. But now we're seeing much more tourists arriving from the region, particularly from India and China, and a lot of them tend to be more city based tourism. They are like interested in shopping, they're interested in sort of like history, so because of that, the supplementary tourist establishments seem to have been better able to sort of cater to that kind of market. So what we in general call experiential tourism, that has been the sort of thing that has been picking up. So I think even prior to this, some of the formal hotel operators have been facing difficulties because of this. So, but hopefully, if you're trying to see what are the possible silver linings from this thing, is that, maybe if this might be like another wake-up call for the hotel operators to, to really understand what are the segment that they're trying to follow.
Now, hotels can, restructure their business plan in this way. Now, looking at Sri Lanka as a market, apart from all this trouble, how would you classify, Sri Lanka to go forward with their tourism industry? What sectors should we really pay attention to?
So I think an area which we've sort of like we've not focused on too much, which I think we have a lot of potential on, is when it comes to MICE tourists, the potential to have like the meetings and exhibitions and things. So now in the immediate aftermath of this, we saw that some of the planned conferences and some of the conventions have been postponed or been cancelled. But I feel that is an area where we have a very attractive value proposition, because compared to what they see is that, typically the tourists or the sort of visitors who come for that are coming for spending only a few days in the country. So if you take, even our sort of like a geographical size, and the sort of like the different types of activities that the experience you can get in Sri Lanka, it's a very attractive proposition. If you stay in Sri Lanka for 2-3 days, you can get, there's like so many different activities you can cover within that short time. So I think that's an area we haven't targeted as much. So one reason was because we didn't have the infrastructure in place in terms of having like these large conference facilities and things like that. But some of the large hotel operators are now doing that, and plus with the new port city development coming in also, that's also overall going to raise the attractiveness of the city. Because by attracting that category of tourists is also one way we can increase the tourist earnings as well. Because over the past few years, what we've been seeing is that while the tourist arrivals has been growing, the tourist earnings hasn't been picking up as much. So this is one area I think we can focus on more.
Now, talking about the situation at hand, what can governments and firms do to mitigate this?
So very much the focus has to be on trying to improving that sentiment. Yeah. So even the tourism bureau chief, I think today in the news article, I think he made a very clear statement that his focus should be on the tourism promotion. So very much trying to restore that confidence in. So one is you need to very much go ahead with the sort of the marketing campaigns that have already been launched, because looking at last year, even though we had, particularly towards the end of last year, we had all the political disruptions that were taking place, which again was something that affected the tourism. But because of those marketing efforts that were put in place, the So Sri Lanka brand and the sort of the CNN marketing campaign, that was a factor that really mitigated the tourism doing much worse than what it was. So very we need to build on that momentum and keep going with that. At the same time, we need to see the government authorities kind of making sure that they're taking tangible steps to reassure the tourists that their safety is being assured.
All right, Travis, thank you for that update. It was very useful and very helpful as well. Security and of course marketing, very important. With that, we have to wind up today's edition of Business Today. Thank you for joining us. Please do join us next time.